The USS Gerald R. Ford, the most formidable warship ever built, a floating fortress and the unshakable emblem of American naval supremacy. At 100,000 tons, armed with 90 aircraft and protected by what sailors call the Iron Shield of the Seas, it was believed to be untouchable. But in the early hours of July 14, 2025, the unimaginable unfolded. From the deck of the Chinese carrier Shandong, 120 hypersonic missiles roared into the sky. Accelerating beyond Mach 8, they split into 3 attack vectors, converging on the Ford with one clear intent: to annihilate America's pride. Within 200 seconds, the Pacific was thrown into chaos. The Ford, for the first time in its service, was under direct, overwhelming assault. What followed was a historic clash, an unprecedented defensive battle that triggered a retaliatory strike shaking Beijing's resolve to its core. But was this sudden onslaught a reckless gamble by China? Or the opening move of a long-crafted strategy to shatter America's place as the world's top military power? What you are about to read marks the first time in the 21st century that the so-called invincible aircraft carrier faced the fury of a hypersonic storm. And as history has often shown, the United States struck back with a fury few anticipated. 5:18 a.m., July 14, 2025. South of the Mariana Islands, the ocean lay still, its surface glassy beneath a fading moon. The horizon was calm, deceptively calm. But beneath that serenity, war machines stirred. In minutes, the balance of power in the Pacific would be tested. Over 250 nautical miles away, the Chinese carrier Shandong initiated a sudden maneuver. Inside its hangars, long-hidden systems powered up, coming alive after months of concealment. In less than 90 seconds, 40 GJ-11 sharp-sword stealth drones launched into the pre-dawn sky. These drones did not carry bombs or missiles. Instead, they wove an intricate web of electronic warfare, jamming frequencies, releasing heat flares, scattering radar decoys, and deploying thick plumes of smoke. A storm of false signals, phantom echoes, and misleading heat signatures engulfed the air, blinding surveillance networks. At the peak of this deception, the real strike began. From the Shandong's flight deck, from its Type 055 destroyer escorts, and from a Type 093B submarine lurking off Palau's seabed, 120 DF-ZF Block 3 hypersonic missiles ignited in unison. Each carried a maneuverable warhead capable of shifting course mid-flight. Some climbed to 60,000 feet before diving at supersonic angles, while others skimmed barely 6 meters above the waves, impossible to track. Together, they formed a killing lattice designed to engulf the USS Gerald R. Ford. As the missiles streaked out of their launch bays, the night sky east of the Philippines lit up like a false dawn. Within 18 seconds, U.S. reconnaissance satellites in low Earth orbit picked up the blazing launch signatures, but intervention was already out of reach. At a range of 200 nautical miles, the Ford and her escort group had less than 80 seconds to respond. Inside the Combat Information Center, CIC, of the Ford, Rear Admiral Rachel Dean, the first woman to command Carrier Strike Group 5, fixed her eyes on the radar. Her screen bloomed with dozens of crimson tracks, so many they blurred together like a swarm of hornets. "This isn't a drill. They're live," she said hoarsely before issuing the order. "Activate Layer 1 defense. Prioritize speed intercepts." The ship awakened instantly. Sirens howled across the decks. Emergency lights flashed crimson through the corridors. Even in their bunks, sailors scrambled as the Ford transformed into a living machine of war. Radar operators worked with frantic precision. This was no simulation, no exercise. The attack integrated electronic, aerial, and missile warfare in a scale never before witnessed outside theoretical war games. The first missile entered the Ford's defense envelope, detected by the SPY-6 radar at 127 kilometers out. Its path twisted unpredictably, altering trajectory 7 times in 5 seconds, forcing the system into real-time adaptive tracking mode. Seconds later, the sky west of the Ford lit with streaks of fire. Hypersonic trails screamed overhead, their sheer velocity overwhelming traditional defense algorithms. But the Gerald R. Ford was no ordinary carrier. It represented 2 decades of design and more than $13 billion of American engineering. Tonight, it would prove its worth. On the starboard side, 2 missiles broke through the first line of interception, one detonating just 90 meters from the hull. The blast rocked the ship, hurling auxiliary tanks into the sea and listing the deck for moments. On the port side, a drone skimmed the water's surface, rising suddenly before self-destructing in a blaze that showered the radar tower in debris. Despite the chaos, no compartments were breached, no lives lost. Yet the message from Beijing was clear: we can take you down. This was no test, no bluff. It was a deliberate precision strike, carried out with real firepower against a real American target. In just 88 seconds, the Pacific airspace between Micronesia and Guam was flooded with hypersonic fire, triggering every U.S. base in the region into maximum alert. Inside the Pacific Command, PACOM, network, alarms flashed red across secure terminals. Multi-vector hypersonic strike in progress. Target CSG-5. Across the globe, senior officers at the Pentagon were jolted awake. The age of hypersonic warfare had arrived. An emergency session inside the NORAD command bunker began just 6 minutes after the first missile launches were detected. Maps glowed red. Voices muttered in disbelief. But everyone present knew the truth. This fight would not be decided in Colorado. The fate of the moment belonged to the sailors on the warships. The USS Gerald R. Ford had exactly 18 seconds before the first wave of 120 hypersonic predators crashed into the perimeter of its close-in defenses. No one in command spoke aloud, yet the same thought pulsed through every officer's mind. Can we hold? Then, like a giant beast roused from its slumber, the Gerald R. Ford came alive. The awakening of a fortress. As the first missile breached the 100-kilometer boundary, the Ford ceased being just an aircraft carrier. It became a fully realized war machine, engineered not simply to project air power but to survive hell itself. The entire integrated combat system was switched into full authority mode. The SPY-6 radar array lit up the dark, tracking 162 supersonic signatures at once, each screaming in at Mach 8, a feat considered science fiction only years earlier. The order came sharp, without hesitation. Engage all targets. Fire authority, Alpha. Signals flashed across the battle group. On the deck of the destroyer USS Pell, stationed 3. 4 nautical miles south of the Ford, 16 SM-6. Dual 2 interceptors launched in rapid succession, streaking high into the stratosphere. Their piercing cry split the night before vanishing into trails of plasma. Seconds later, the sky erupted, a cascade of white blossoms as 5 Chinese warheads were shredded in midair in under 4 seconds. The explosions were silent to the crews below, but the blinding flashes above told every sailor one thing. The first volley had been broken. Layer by layer, the shield holds closer to the carrier, the Mk-41 vertical launch system roared open. 24 evolved C Sparrow Block II missiles streaked outward in salvos of 3, flying not as weapons of destruction, but as guardians, each programmed to collide head-on with hypersonic intruders. For the next 52 seconds, the night sky became a chessboard of lethal moves. Not a second passed without an interception. One DF-ZF missile was struck just 400 meters overhead, disintegrating into a storm of molten debris. The burning fragments splashed into the sea a mere 212 meters from the Ford, throwing up a 25-meter wave that drenched Radar Tower 3 in seawater. Yet, defense is never only about distance. When a few missiles clawed through the outer shield, the Ford's close-in weapon systems, CIWS, engaged. The twin Phalanx 20mm Vulcan cannons, mounted on the port and stern, thundered to life. In only 7 seconds, each gun spat 850 armor-piercing rounds, weaving a glowing curtain of steel too dense for anything to penetrate. One Chinese GJ-11 stealth drone, skimming barely 8 meters above the waves, managed to slip through the chaos. Masked by residual signal interference, it streaked toward the Ford's deck from the northeast. But at just 90 meters out, the CIWS locked on and spat its final, merciless burst. The drone shattered midair, raining twisted shards of metal across the deck. Some fragments pierced the outer shell of the command tower, spraying glass across. A console. No one panicked. No fires, no screams. One sailor silently dabbed a line of blood from his forehead where glass had cut him, and then returned to his station. A glimpse of the future war. On the destroyer, USS Curtis Wilbur, positioned northwest of the Ford, the Helios laser defense system fired in combat for the very first time. A concentrated beam of high-energy light locked onto a DFZF skimming 2, low and too fast for traditional defenses. In just 4 seconds, the laser melted the missile's outer casing, frying its guidance package. The crippled warhead spiraled wildly, splashing into the ocean 2 kilometers short of its target, leaving only a column of smoke and a hiss of steam. The fury lasted just 3 minutes and 19 seconds, an eternity in hypersonic warfare. The ocean. Heaved with shock waves, the Ford's hull shuddered with near misses, and the night sky burned with fire trails. Then, silence. Screens across the Combat Information Center shifted from crimson alerts to a muted green. The radar confirmed. No, more inbound targets. Out of 120 hypersonic missiles, 118 had been destroyed. The last 2 detonated harmlessly more than 80 meters away, close enough to rattle armor plates and shake antennas, but not close enough to break through. Damage, minimal. Casualties, 0. The Ford still stood, scarred but unbroken. Inside the command room, Admiral Rachel Dean remained silent for several long moments, eyes fixed on the tactical display. Finally, she spoke in a measured, resolute tone. "They threw their best at us, and we're still here." Moments later, a secure transmission from the Pentagon cut through the static. The order was unmistakable. Full authority granted. Counterstrike approved. Mission code, Scythe. At 5:22 a.m., the Pacific briefly settled back into silence. The waves once again rolled gently as if nothing had happened, but every gaze aboard the Ford turned westward, toward the fleeing silhouette of the Shandong. At 5:28 a.m., the ocean was calm again, but it was the calm of a storm's aftermath, heavy, charged with energy and waiting for the next strike. And now, it was America's turn to act. The order came directly from the Pentagon, short, unambiguous, and absolute. Mission code, Scythe. The USS Gerald R. Ford and her strike group were now cleared to unleash their full offensive might. The message carried no rhetoric, no justifications. Only one meaning: whoever had dared fire 120 hypersonic missiles at America would pay in kind. The counter-strike begins. At Andersen Air Force Base, Guam, 2 sleek silhouettes rolled onto the runway under floodlight. They were B-21 Raider stealth bombers, America's newest ghost aircraft, never before used in live combat. Each carried 2 AGM-183A ARW hypersonic anti-ship missiles, weapons designed to annihilate entire floating cities. As the Raiders began their takeoff run, 2 EA-18G Growlers from the Ford strike group lifted into the sky, tasked with electronic shielding. Above the Pacific, a swarm of MQ-28 Ghost Bat drones skimmed just 150 feet above the surface of the sea, moving silently across the waters between the Batanes Islands and the Luzon Strait. The Shandong, still fleeing westward, sought cover under coastal radar zones. But the Ghost Bats, AI-driven, built on joint US-Australian design, were not just scouts. They jammed enemy frequencies, mapped false signals, cleaned interference, and transmitted precise coordinates in real time to the incoming bombers. No voices broke the silence. No commander gave redundant orders. The strike was entirely automated, seamless, and invisible. 6:02 a.m. The B-21s crossed into their tactical attack range, the point of no return. From this moment, every maneuver was pre-programmed for maximum lethality. The Shandong was on high alert. 2 Type 055 destroyers guarded her eastern and southern flanks, their Type 346B radars straining through a storm of electronic deception generated by U.S. forces. Yet amidst the static, amidst the ghosts, 2 signatures were missed. 2 tiny crosshairs closing in at Mach 7. By the time they were detected, the missiles were only seconds away. 6:06 a.m. The first ARRW slammed into the Shandong's forward flight deck, detonating directly above the J-15 fighter hangars. The blast tore open steel like paper, scattering parked aircraft into the air like children's toys. Within 10 seconds, the carrier's deck was an inferno, flames racing uncontrolled across fuel lines and munitions. The second ARRW struck the aft section, where ammunition magazines and aviation fuel reserves were stored. The result was catastrophic, a massive secondary detonation from the auxiliary fuel depot. The ship heeled sharply, listing 8 degrees to port. Lights flickered, then died. Entire power grids collapsed. The Shandong's defensive systems went dark. Even its automated firefighting network failed to respond. Smoke billowed into the dawn sky. The carrier was no longer fighting. It was bleeding out. Nearby, the escort destroyer Hefei 117, caught in shielding position, was struck by flying debris. Shrapnel smashed through its radar dome, severing its command capability within minutes. Across the Shandong's bridge, flight control was obliterated. Comms went silent. From space, U.S. satellites noted a sudden blackout of Chinese naval signals. On the Chinese mainland, commanders waited for updates that never came. Meanwhile, the Ghost Bats hovered, unseen, transmitting every frame of the unfolding disaster directly to the Pentagon. At 6:14 a.m., just 8 minutes after the first U.S. missile was fired, Admiral Rachel Dean received confirmation from Pacific Command. Shandong, combat ineffective. Status, uncontrolled retreat. China's largest aircraft carrier, the EU, pride of its blue water naval expansion, was crippled beyond recovery in less than 10 minutes. No images would ever be released. No White House briefing would follow. No diplomatic sparring. No saber-rattling on international news. Only a single internal message circulated within the Pentagon. We didn't start it. We ended it. The quiet. After the storm. That night, aboard the USS Gerald R. Ford, the command room remained lit. Officers drafted after-action reports, their hands still trembling from adrenaline. Yet Admiral Rachel Dean refused any celebrations, denied any public commendations. Instead, she wrote a